The final stitch was a betrayal. Lady Elara Ashworth stared down at the intricate embroidery on the cuff of her wedding gown, a single pearl sewn slightly askew, a tiny, rebellious flaw in a sea of perfect ivory silk. It was a reflection of her own heart, a heart that should have been soaring with bridal anticipation, but was instead tethered by a thread of inexplicable dread. For weeks, a disquiet had settled over her like the fine dust on the forgotten furniture in the north wing of Ashworth Manor. It was in the way her fiancé, Lord Valerius Cretian, now looked not at her, but past her. His gaze, once a warm haven, had become a polite, vacant space, and it almost always came to rest on her younger sister, Seraphina. Seraphina, whose laughter was like wind chimes in a summer breeze, whose smile could coax the sun from behind the most stubborn of clouds. Elara's own smile was a quieter thing, a gentle curving of the lips that spoke of contentment, not effervescence. She was the steady oak to Seraphina's vibrant rose, dependable and strong, but rarely the subject of a poet's sonnet. Her father, a man whose love for his daughters was tragically eclipsed by his ineptitude with finances, had often praised Elara's sensibility. "You, my dear, are the bedrock of this family," he would say, patting her hand. It was meant as a compliment, but it felt like a sentence to a lifetime of being solid, unmovable, and utterly overlooked. This marriage to Valerius was to be the family's salvation. The Cretian fortune was vast, enough to absorb the Ashworth debts and restore their crumbling estate. Elara had accepted her role with the quiet dignity expected of her. She did not love Valerius with the fiery passion of the novels she secretly read, but she felt a deep, steady affection for him. She believed they could build a life of mutual respect and quiet companionship. She had allowed herself to dream of it, of children's laughter echoing in the halls of Cretian Hall, of a stable future free from the ever-present shadow of the bailiffs. The day of the announcement dawned grey and weeping, the sky a mirror of Elara's soul. The drawing-room was filled with their closest relations, the air thick with the scent of wilting lilies and strained pleasantries. Elara stood beside Valerius, her hand resting formally on his arm. The fabric of his coat felt stiff and foreign beneath her gloved fingers. He had not met her eyes once that morning. Her father cleared his throat, a sound like gravel shifting. "My dear friends, we are gathered today for a most joyous occasion." He never finished the sentence. Valerius stepped forward, gently disengaging his arm from Elara's. The small movement was a cataclysm, a sundering of worlds. He turned, and his eyes, those blue eyes that had once promised her a future, found Seraphina across the room. And in that look, Elara saw it all. The stolen glances, the whispered conversations in shadowed corners, the shared smiles that had felt like tiny daggers in her heart. It was not her imagination. It was real. "I cannot," Valerius said, his voice ringing with a desperate, theatrical clarity that turned Elara's blood to ice. "I cannot proceed with this union. It would be a lie, a disservice to a lady as fine as Elara." He paused, his gaze fixed on Seraphina, who looked up at him with wide, luminous eyes, a perfect portrait of shocked innocence. "My heart," he declared, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion, "belongs to another. It belongs to Seraphina." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Elara felt nothing and everything at once. A profound, ringing silence filled her ears, even as a cacophony of whispers erupted around her. She saw her mother's face, a mask of fury and calculation. She saw her fathers crumble into utter despair. She saw Seraphina, a single, perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek, a masterpiece of sorrowful beauty. But most of all, she saw the truth. She was the cornerstone that had been discarded, the practical choice abandoned for a beautiful, intoxicating dream. The bedrock had cracked. Humiliation was a physical force, a hot wave that washed over her, threatening to buckle her knees. But the years of being the sensible one, the strong one, had forged a spine of steel within her. She did not weep. She did not faint. She simply stood, her posture erect, her gaze fixed on a portrait of a long-dead ancestor on the far wall. She would not give them the satisfaction of her collapse. She was an Ashworth, and while their finances might be in ruins, her dignity was not. The ensuing chaos was a blur. Guests departed in a flurry of scandalized murmurs. Her mother's recriminations were sharp and cruel, aimed not at the feckless Valerius or the triumphant Seraphina, but at Elara herself. You were too reserved, too bookish. You did not hold his interest. It was her fault, always her fault. By evening, the full weight of their ruin had settled. The Cretan alliance was not merely broken, it was poisonously inverted. Valerius, besotted and foolish, had promised to marry Seraphina, but on his own terms, with no mention of the Ashworth debts. They were cast adrift. Days turned into a week of suffocating silence and thinly veiled panic. Elara confined herself to the library, the scent of old paper and leather a balm to her shredded nerves. It was there, amidst the silent companionship of books, that the butler announced an unexpected visitor. "The Duke of Blackwood is here to see you, my lady." Elara's breath caught. Alistair Blackwood, the Duke of Blackwood, a name spoken in whispers, a man of immense wealth and power who lived as a recluse on his vast, remote estate, Blackwood Manor. He was a creature of shadow and rumour. Some said he was disfigured, others that he had gone mad after the tragic death of his young wife years ago. No one had seen him in society for nearly a decade. Curiosity, a feeling she had thought long dead, warred with trepidation. What could such a man possibly want with her, a jilted bride, at the heart of the season's most vicious scandal? She found him standing before the hearth in the dreary drawing-room, a tall, imposing silhouette against the weak afternoon light. He was not disfigured. In fact, he was devastatingly handsome in a severe, sculpted way. His face was all sharp angles and stark planes, his hair as black as a raven's wing, his eyes a startling pale grey, like a winter sky. But it was his stillness that was most unnerving. He stood with an absolute economy of motion, his presence sucking the warmth and sound from the room. He was a void, a place where light and life went to die. He did not offer pleasantries. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, resonant baritone, devoid of any inflection. "Lady Elara Ashworth, I have come to make you a proposition." She inclined her head, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Your Grace." "I am aware of your situation," he stated, the words clipped and precise. "The perfidy of Lord Valerius, the subsequent financial peril your family now faces." He spoke of her utter humiliation, as if discussing the price of corn. There was no pity in his gaze, only a cool, unnerving assessment. "I require a wife," he continued, his grey eyes locking onto hers. "I have a title and an estate that require an heir, a duchess to manage the household with quiet efficiency. I have no interest in courtship, affection, or any of the sentimental trappings of marriage. It will be a contract, a partnership of mutual convenience. Elara stared at him, trying to comprehend the sheer audacity of his words. He was offering her a lifeline, but it was a cold, iron chain. "You, Lady Elara, have been publicly discarded," he said, the slightest pause before the word making it all the more brutal. "You are therefore unlikely to be entertaining romantic notions. You are known for your composure and your sense of duty. These are qualities I find acceptable." Acceptable. The word was a slap. She was not desirable, not cherished, but acceptable, a functional component for his life's machinery. "In exchange for your hand," he went on, his gaze unwavering, "I will settle the entirety of the Ashworth debt. Your family will be secure. You will be the Duchess of Blackwood, with all the station and security that title affords. Your duties will be to provide a male heir and to run my home without disturbing my solitude. My life, my work, and my privacy are to remain inviolate. You will have your own wing of the manor. We will take our meals together on occasion for the sake of appearances before the staff. Beyond that, you will not be expected to seek my company, nor I yours. There will be no love. There will be no companionship. Do you understand these terms?" He laid it all bare, with the cold precision of a surgeon. A life of gilded emptiness, a marriage that was a tomb. And yet, what was her alternative? A life of genteel poverty, of pitying looks and whispered gossip, of watching her sister live the life that was supposed to have been hers. The Duke of Blackwood was offering her an escape, a cold, dark, silent escape, but an escape nonetheless. He was offering her survival. He was not asking for her heart, the very thing she no longer trusted to give. He was asking for her duty, her composure, the only things she had left. She looked at this formidable, broken man, a man who had built walls of ice around himself, and she saw a strange, distorted reflection of her own pain. He was shrouded in grief. She was shrouded in shame. Perhaps two such ghosts could coexist in the silent halls of his great house. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, she met his winter-grey eyes without flinching. "I understand your terms, Your Grace." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes, so fleeting she might have imagined it. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Very well. We shall be married by special license at the end of the week." And with that, the Duke of Blackwood turned and left, leaving Elara alone in the deepening twilight, the Duchess in waiting of a kingdom of shadows. She had traded one loveless future for another, but this one at least was of her own choosing. It was a choice made not of hope, but of pure, unadorned survival. The pearl on her abandoned wedding gown was still askew, a silent testament to a world where perfection was a lie, and a flawed, lonely peace was the only prize worth fighting for. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a passage into another realm. The carriage rattled through rolling green hills that gradually gave way to stark, wind-swept moorland. The sky above, a bruised and brooding purple. A thick fog rolled in, clinging to the gnarled trees and ancient stone fences, muffling the world in a damp, grey silence. It felt to Elara as if she were travelling not just north, but back in time, to an age of myth and sorrow. Blackwood Manor rose from the mist like a jagged tooth of granite, a sprawling Gothic edifice of towers and turrets, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over the desolate landscape. It was not a home. It was a fortress built to keep the world at bay. As the carriage drew to a halt on the gravel drive, a murder of crows erupted from the skeletal branches of a great oak their harsh cries the only welcome. The Duke was not there to greet her. The massive oak doors were opened by a severe, rail-thin housekeeper who introduced herself as Mrs. Gable. Her face was a roadmap of disciplined worry, and her eyes, though sharp, held a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. "Welcome to Blackwood, Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp and starched. Her use of the title was jarring. Ilara was a duchess now, a title she had acquired in a cold 10-minute ceremony in a dusty London office, witnessed only by 2 solicitors. Her husband had placed a heavy gold band on her finger, his touch brief and impersonal, and had departed immediately for the north, leaving her to follow a day later. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Ilara replied, her own voice sounding small in the cavernous, stone-flagged entrance hall. A vast, cold space, dominated by a grand staircase that swept up into shadows. The hall was lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors, their dark, judgmental eyes seeming to follow her every move. The air was still and frigid, carrying the faint, funereal scent of beeswax and old stone. There were no flowers, no welcoming fire in the enormous hearth. The silence was absolute, a living presence. Mrs. Gable led her through a labyrinth of corridors. "His Grace has instructed that you be given the East Wing. It has the finest views of the sea." The East Wing was a set of beautifully appointed but profoundly lonely rooms. A sitting room, a dressing room, and a vast bedchamber, all furnished with heavy, dark wood furniture and rich, somber tapestries. It was luxurious, but it felt like a cage, however gilded. The promised view was of a churning, grey sea under a perpetually overcast sky. "His Grace dines at 8, Mrs. Gable informed her. "He will expect you in the dining hall. He does not care for conversation during meals." The warning was clear. Her presence was a requirement, her silence a command. That first dinner was an exercise in exquisite agony. The dining hall was a cavernous chamber built for feasting. Yet the 2 of them sat at opposite ends of a table that could have seated 40, separated by a vast, polished expanse of mahogany. The only sounds were the clinking of silver on porcelain and the soft footsteps of the serving staff. The Duke did not look at her. He ate with a focused, mechanical precision, his gaze fixed on his plate. Ilara found it impossible to swallow. Every bite felt like sawdust in her mouth. She studied him from across the chasm, this man who was her husband. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hand, when it rested on the table, was curled into a fist. She saw the profound, bone-deep weariness in his eyes when he momentarily looked up to signal a footman. This was not just a cold man. This was a man hollowed out by grief, a man who had meticulously exorcised every trace of joy from his own life. The fortress was not the stone walls of his home. It was the architecture of his soul. Days bled into one another, each a perfect replica of the last. She would wake, take her breakfast alone in her sitting room, and then wander the silent, echoing halls of the manor. She tried reading in the colossal library, but the sheer volume of silent books felt oppressive. She walked the manicured lawns at the front of the house, but the wind off the sea was relentless and chilling. She was a ghost in a ghost's house, her husband a fleeting shadow she saw only at dinner. He kept his word with absolute fidelity. He did not seek her company. He did not speak to her. He did not exist, save for that silent, agonizing hour each evening. She learned of his routines through observation. He spent his days locked in his study in the West Wing, a part of the house Mrs. Gable had politely but firmly indicated was forbidden to her. He rode out at dawn each morning, a solitary, black-clad figure on a powerful black stallion, disappearing into the mists of the moor for hours. He was a man of iron self-control, of impenetrable discipline, yet she began to notice the cracks, tiny, almost imperceptible fissures in his glacial facade. One evening at dinner, a footman dropped a silver tray with a clatter that shattered the oppressive silence. The Duke flinched, a violent, full-body reaction, and his hand shot to his chest. His eyes, for a single, unguarded moment, were wide with a raw, naked panic, a look of such profound terror that it stole Ilara's breath. Then, just as quickly, the mask of cold indifference slammed back into place. But she had seen it. Beneath the ice, there was a raging sea of pain. Another time, walking in the grounds, she saw him standing by a small stone mausoleum in the distance, half hidden by a copse of weeping willows. He stood utterly still for nearly an hour, his head bowed, a solitary mourner in a world of his own making. He was not just grieving, he was performing a vigil. Her loneliness was a physical ache. She had traded the sharp, public humiliation of her old life for the slow, private erosion of this one. She had no one to talk to. Mrs. Gable was respectful, but distant, the staff quiet and cowed by their master's somber nature. Ilara felt herself beginning to fade, to become as grey and silent as the stone walls around her. She had to do something, find some small corner of this world to make her own, or she would simply cease to be. It was on a walk to the far side of the estate, seeking a path she had not yet trod, that she found it. Tucked behind a high stone wall, almost completely obscured by a thick curtain of ivy, was a heavy, iron-bound wooden door. It was rusted shut, a thick chain and a formidable padlock securing it against the world. Curiosity, a spark she thought long extinguished, flickered to life. Her fingers traced the cold, pitted iron of the lock. Where did it lead? She asked Mrs. Gable about it that afternoon. The housekeeper's face tightened, her usual composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "That is the old garden, Your Grace, the Duchess's garden." She did not need to clarify which Duchess. "It has been locked since she passed." "Why?" Ilara asked gently. Mrs. Gable looked down at her hands, twisting the ring of keys at her waist. His Grace could not bear it. It was her favorite place. He ordered it sealed. No one has set foot in it for 10 years. A garden, locked away for a decade. A place of life, sentenced to decay. The symbolism was not lost on Ilara. It was a perfect metaphor for the Duke himself. A heart, once full of love and life, now sealed away, left to wither in the darkness behind impenetrable walls. A strange, defiant purpose began to bloom in the barren soil of Ilara's heart. She would not fade away in this house of sorrow. She would not become another ghost haunting its halls. She would find life, even if she had to cultivate it from the dust herself. This garden, this forgotten, locked-away piece of the past, would be her sanctuary. And perhaps, just perhaps, in bringing it back to life, she might find a way to start living again herself. She would ask her husband for the key. It was a terrifying thought to deliberately seek him out, to break the unspoken rules of their cold truce. But the alternative, the slow, silent surrender to the grey emptiness, was infinitely more frightening. She would face the Duke. She would ask for the key to his buried heart. The decision to approach the Duke felt like preparing for battle. Ilara spent the entire day rehearsing her request, her words, her tone. She would be calm, respectful, and practical. She would not betray any hint of the emotional significance the garden had already taken on in her mind. It was merely a way to occupy her time, she would say, a project to oversee. A duchess, after all, should have a project. She waited until after their silent dinner. As he rose to leave, his customary sharp nod, the only acknowledgement of her presence, she found her voice. "Your Grace," she said, the words emerging steadier than she felt. He stopped, turning slowly. In the flickering candlelight, his face was a mask of shadows and sharp angles. His pale grey eyes held a flicker of surprise. She had never initiated a conversation before. "I have a request," she continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap beneath the table. He remained silent, waiting. His stillness was an unnerving pressure, a demand for brevity. "I have discovered the walled garden on the east side of the grounds. Mrs. Gable informed me it has been locked for some years." She kept her gaze steady, meeting his. "I would like your permission to restore it. I find I have a great deal of time, and I have always had an interest in horticulture. It would be a suitable occupation." She watched his face for any reaction, any shift in that glacial composure. For a long moment, there was nothing. The air grew thick with unspoken history. She had trespassed, she knew, into a sacred, sorrowful place. He was going to refuse. The thought sent a chill of disappointment through her. Then his expression changed. It was a subtle shift, a tightening around his eyes, a flicker of something that looked like immense pain, swiftly and brutally suppressed. He looked not at her, but through her, at a ghost only he could see. "The garden is derelict," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It is a place of weeds and ruin. There is nothing there for you. Things can be replanted," she countered softly. "What is ruined can be remade." The words hung in the air between them, imbued with a meaning far deeper than either of them would acknowledge. She was speaking of soil and seeds, but he knew, he knew, that she was also speaking of something else entirely. He stared at her for a long, silent eternity. She felt as though he were weighing not her request, but her very soul, her motivations, her intent. Was she a threat to the careful, desolate peace he had constructed for himself? Finally, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "As you wish," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It is a meaningless pursuit, but if it occupies you, so be it. Mrs. Gable has the key. Instruct her to give it to you." He turned without another word and strode from the room, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. Ilara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. He had agreed. With cold indifference, he had agreed. He had handed her the key to his wife's memorial, to his own locked-away past, and dismissed it as a meaningless pursuit. But to Ilara, it was everything. It was a beginning. The next morning, Mrs. Gable handed her the key. It was a large, ornate thing of heavy, rusted iron. It felt ancient, a key from a fairy tale, promising entry into a forgotten world. The housekeeper's eyes were full of a cautious, worried curiosity. "If you require assistance, Your Grace, the groundsman." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Ilara said, her hand closing around the cold metal. "But for now, I would like to see it for myself." The walk to the garden wall was filled with a nervous anticipation that felt like a foreign country. The lock was stiff and protested with a groan of tortured metal, but finally it yielded. The heavy door swung inward on creaking hinges, revealing the secret it had guarded for a decade. The sight before her was one of beautiful, tragic decay. It was not the place of weeds and ruin the Duke had described. It was a place that had been expertly designed, a masterpiece of landscape artistry now surrendered to the wild, patient reclamation of nature. A stone path, almost completely obscured by moss and creeping vines, wound its way through what had once been formal beds. A sundial stood tilted in the center, its face green with verdigris. A crumbling stone bench sat beneath the tangled, overgrown branches of a climbing rose that had run rampant, its thorny arms enveloping the structure in a fierce embrace. Weeds grew in profusion, yes, but they grew amongst the stubborn survivors. Resilient clumps of lavender fought for sunlight, their scent still faint on the air. A hardy strain of iris pushed its green spears through the choked earth, and everywhere were roses. Wild, untamed, their blooms small but fiercely fragrant, they had climbed over everything, their thorny tendrils a testament to a defiant, lingering beauty. It was a place of profound sadness, but also of profound peace. The high stone walls muffled the sound of the wind, creating a pocket of stillness. Sunlight, weak as it was, filtered through the overgrown canopy, dappling the mossy ground. Elara breathed it in, the scent of damp earth, of decay, and of the faint, sweet perfume of the surviving flowers. This was not a graveyard. It was a place that was sleeping, waiting. She spent hours that first day simply walking, observing, touching. She ran her fingers over the rough bark of a fruit tree that had gone wild, its branches a tangled mess. She gently pushed aside the leaves of a sprawling vine to uncover a small stoned bird bath, its basin filled with dark, stagnant rainwater. She saw the ghost of what it had been, a place of love, a sanctuary of beauty and life. The late Duchess Isabel must have been a woman of great passion and patience. Her work began slowly, tentatively. She started with her own hands, wearing a pair of thick gardening gloves she found in a disused potting shed nearby. She did not attack the wilderness. Instead, she began a gentle negotiation with it. She started with one small bed near the entrance, patiently, painstakingly, pulling the choking weeds from around a cluster of struggling peonies. The work was hard, her muscles quickly aching in protest. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate work of embroidery, became sore and calloused. But the physical exertion was a balm. It quieted the relentless churn of her thoughts, focusing her mind on the simple, tangible task before her: to clear, to nurture, to restore. Each day she would retreat to her sanctuary. She brought order to a small patch of chaos, and in doing so felt a sense of purpose she had not known since before her world had shattered. The groundsmen, initially watching her from a distance with skeptical curiosity, eventually offered their help, which she gratefully accepted for the heavier tasks of pruning the overgrown trees and turning the compacted soil. But the delicate work, the weeding, the tending of the survivors, she reserved for herself. She discovered a single rosebush, half choked by ivy, that produced the most exquisite deep crimson blossoms, their scent rich and intoxicating. She freed it from its prison of vines, carefully pruning the dead wood, feeding its roots. It became the heart of the garden for her, a symbol of resilient beauty surviving against all odds. She did not know that she was being watched. From the window of his West Wing study, the Duke would stand, hidden by the shadows of the room, and observe her. He watched her toil, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw the way she would gently touch a new bud, the small, genuine smile that would grace her lips when she uncovered a long dormant plant pushing its way toward the sun. He watched this quiet, composed woman he had married for her lack of sentimentality bring his wife's ghost back to life, and he felt a confusing, unwelcome turmoil in the frozen sea of his heart. He had expected her to give up, to be defeated by the scale of the decay. He had not expected this gentle, relentless patience. He had not expected her to understand that the garden was not a thing to be conquered, but a thing to be healed. One late afternoon, a week into her project, Elara was kneeling by the crimson rose bush, carefully tying one of its canes to a new stake she had driven into the ground. A shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled, to see the Duke standing on the path behind her. It was the first time he had ever entered the garden. He stood for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the small area she had cleared, the neat piles of weeds, the freshly turned earth. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. Elara's heart pounded. She had trespassed. He was going to tell her to stop. He took a step closer, his eyes finally settling on the rosebush she was tending. "That one," he said, his voice quiet, rougher than usual. Isabel called it the constant heart. She said it bloomed longer and deeper than any of the others. Elara was speechless. It was the first time he had ever spoken his late wife's name to her. It felt like a stone dropped into a deep, still well. He looked from the rose to Elara, his gaze lingering on her dirt-smudged cheek and the calloused fingers of her gloved hand. "It is a stubborn thing," he observed, his voice still low, but with a new, strange inflection she couldn't quite decipher. To have survived so long in all this neglect. He paused, his pale eyes meeting hers. "You have a similar tenacity, it would seem." And then he turned and walked away, leaving Elara kneeling in the dirt, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was not a compliment, not exactly. It was a simple observation delivered with his usual stark economy. But it was the first time he had ever truly seen her, had ever spoken to her as a person rather than a contractual obligation. It was a flicker of warmth in the unending winter, a single, perfect, crimson blossom in a garden of sorrow. It was a glimmer of something she had not dared to hope for, and it was enough to make her believe that perhaps, just perhaps, not everything that was ruined was lost forever. The Duke's brief appearance in the garden and his even briefer, almost impersonal words shifted the very atmosphere of Blackwood Manor. It was a subtle change, as imperceptible as the turning of a season, but Elara felt it. The silence between them at dinner was no longer a chasm of pure emptiness. It was now filled with a low, thrumming tension, the weight of a name spoken aloud, a memory disturbed from its 10-year slumber. He still did not speak to her, but occasionally she would look up and find his gaze on her, a questioning, assessing look that she could not interpret. It was unnerving, yet it was infinitely better than being invisible. Her work in the garden became her life's rhythm. The physical labor strengthened her body, and the slow, visible progress of her efforts mended something deep within her spirit. The central beds were cleared, the paths were once again visible, and the surviving plants, now free to breathe and receive the sun, began to flourish. The crimson rose, the constant heart, produced a new flush of blossoms, their color so vibrant it seemed to bleed into the gray air. One morning, she arrived at the garden to find a new set of high-quality gardening tools. A fine steel trowel, a sharp pair of shears, a sturdy kneeling pad propped against the stone bench. There was no note, no explanation. She knew, with an instinct that went deeper than logic, that they were from him. It was a silent, practical acknowledgement of her work, an offering made in his own stark, wordless language. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar she could barely name it. It was a quiet, fragile form of gratitude. The progress was not confined to the garden. Elara, feeling a measure of confidence return, began to extend her gentle, restorative touch to the house itself. She did not redecorate or move furniture. She simply brought life into the stagnant spaces. She began cutting flowers from the garden, small, hardy bouquets of lavender, resilient roses, and wildflowers she encouraged to grow along the wall, and placing them in vases in the entrance hall, the library, and even on the long, desolate dining table. The first time she placed a small vase containing a single crimson rose at her end of the table, she watched him covertly as he entered the room. He stopped, his gaze falling on the flower. His jaw tightened, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he would order it removed. But he said nothing. He simply took his seat and began the meal, though she noted he did not look at the rose again. The next day, however, when a fresh one was in its place, he did not pause at all. It was a silent battle of wills, a test of boundaries, and her quiet persistence seemed to have won. Just as a tentative, fragile peace seemed to be settling over the manor, a letter arrived, its familiar, elegant script sending a jolt of anxiety through Elara. It was from her sister. Seraphina, now Lady Cretan, was writing to inform Elara that she and her new husband, Valerius, would be in the north and wished to pay a visit. The letter was a confection of cloying sentimentality and false concern. Dearest sister, I do hope you are well in that great draughty castle of yours. We are so anxious to see you and meet your formidable duke. We simply must call upon you. Elara's blood ran cold. The thought of Seraphina and Valerius entering this quiet, wounded space felt like a violation. The thought of seeing them together, of having to witness their happiness, a happiness built upon the ruins of her own, was a torment she could barely contemplate. Her new life was a fragile construct of silence and solitude. It would not withstand the bright, careless intrusion of her past. She had no choice but to inform the Duke. She found him in the library that evening, a place she rarely entered when he was present. He was reading by the fire, the light glinting off his dark hair. "Your Grace," she began, her voice a little unsteady, "I have received a letter." He looked up from his book, his expression impassive. "My sister, Lady Cretan, and her husband wish to visit." She could not bring herself to say Valerius's name. The Duke's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He knew the entire sordid story, of course. He had, in his own cold way, capitalized on it. He set his book down with slow, deliberate care. "And do you wish to receive them?" he asked, his voice neutral. The question caught her off guard. She had assumed it was a social obligation they must endure. His asking for her preference, her wish, was unprecedented. I do not believe it would be a pleasant visit," she admitted, her gaze dropping to the floor. "But to refuse would cause gossip." "Let them gossip," he said, the words sharp and dismissive. "This is your home. You will not be forced to entertain anyone you do not wish to see. A letter can be sent expressing our regrets." Elara stared at him, stunned. He was defending her. He was offering her a shield, a way to avoid the confrontation she so dreaded. The unexpected protectiveness in his gesture was a powerful, disarming thing. For the first time, she felt like she was not just a tenant in his house, but his duchess, his partner in this strange, cold pact. But even as relief washed over her, a new, stronger feeling took its place, a stubborn flicker of pride. She would not hide. She would not let Serafina think she was a broken, pitiful creature cowering in a northern fortress. She had built a life here, a quiet one. But it was hers. She would face them. "No," she said, her voice gaining strength. "No, we should receive them. It's better to face it and be done with it." The Duke studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes searching her face. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Very well. Inform them they may call upon us next Tuesday." The day of the visit arrived, cloaked in a persistent, dreary drizzle. Elara dressed with meticulous care, choosing a simple gown of deep blue velvet that highlighted her composure rather than trying to compete with Serafina's radiance. She felt a nervous tremor in her hands, but her expression in the mirror was calm, serene. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. She would not be undone. Serafina and Valerius arrived in a flurry of fashionable silks and loud greetings that seemed to profane the somber quiet of the manor. Serafina was more beautiful than ever, her happiness a dazzling, almost aggressive force. Valerius looked handsome, but Elara noted a faint restlessness in his eyes, a slight puffiness beneath them that suggested a life of rich food and little substance. "Elara, dearest," Serafina cried, enveloping her in a cloud of expensive French perfume. The embrace was entirely for show. "You look, well, the country air suits you." It was a backhanded compliment, implying she had grown plain and rustic. Valerius had the grace to look uncomfortable. He bowed stiffly. "Your Grace," he murmured, not quite meeting her eyes. Seeing him again was not the stab of pain she had feared. It was more like looking at a stranger, a character from a book she had once read and long since forgotten. The affection she had felt for him had been burned away, leaving only the cool ash of indifference. The true test came when the Duke descended the grand staircase to greet their guests. He moved with his usual silent, imposing grace, a figure of stark authority in his perfectly tailored black coat. The drawing room, already feeling crowded by Serafina's vibrant presence, seemed to shrink around him. He greeted them with a cold, formal nod that bordered on insulting. "Lord Cretian, Lady Cretian." Serafina, never one to be intimidated, launched into a stream of flirtatious chatter, attempting to charm the famously charmless Duke. It was like watching a butterfly beat its wings against a granite cliff. He responded with monosyllabic answers, his gaze flat and bored. The visit culminated in a tense, excruciatingly awkward tea. Serafina, failing to make a dent in the Duke's armor, turned her attention to Elara, her words dripping with false sympathy. "It is such a vast house, Elara. Do you not get terribly lonely? And it is all so dark. It is a shame the gardens have been so neglected. At Cretian Hall, my rose garden is my absolute pride." She then turned her dazzling smile on the Duke. "But I suppose you have more important things to concern yourselves with than flowers, an heir, for instance. I do hope Elara is not too delicate for her duties." The barb was exquisitely cruel, aimed at Elara's perceived fragility and the still childless state of their marriage. The air crackled with tension Ilara felt the blood drain from her face, her teacup rattling in its saucer. Before she could form a reply, the Duke spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like a shard of ice. "My wife's delicacy, Lady Cretan," he said, his pale eyes fixed on Seraphina with a chilling intensity, "is a matter for my concern, not yours, as is the state of my home and the question of my heir." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "And I find my wife's quiet cultivation of beauty in a neglected space infinitely more admirable than the flaunting of that which has been easily won." The insult was unmistakable, a direct and devastating strike at Seraphina's character and her conquest of Valerius. Seraphina's smile froze on her face, her color rising. Valerius shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The butterfly had been crushed. The Duke rose to his feet, a clear signal that the visit was over. "You must be tired from your journey. Do not let us keep you." The departure was swift and cold. As their carriage rattled away down the drive, Ilara stood in the hall, her body trembling with a mixture of shock and a strange, unfamiliar sense of triumph. He had not just defended her. He had championed her. He had taken her side, forming an unspoken, unexpected alliance against the ghosts of her past. She turned to look at him. He was standing by the window, watching the carriage disappear into the rain-swept landscape. The hard lines of his face seemed to soften for a fraction of a second. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. He turned from the window, his gaze meeting hers. The coldness was gone, replaced by something complex and unreadable. "They will not be invited back," he stated, a note of finality in his tone. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They were a partnership, a strange, broken, silent partnership, but a partnership nonetheless. And in that moment of shared victory, in that quiet, rain-lashed hall, Ilara felt the first tentative, terrifying shoots of something far more complicated than gratitude begin to take root in her heart. The aftermath of Seraphina's visit lingered in the air of Blackwood Manor, but it was not the toxic residue Ilara had feared. Instead, it had cleared something between them, like a storm that washes the dust from the sky. The Duke's defense of her had been a public declaration, a drawing of a line in the sand. She was his duchess, and their united front, however cold and formal, was inviolable. This shared challenge had forged a bond, a thin but resilient thread of alliance in the vast tapestry of their silence. A new, tentative rhythm established itself. He began to appear in the garden more frequently. He never stayed long and rarely spoke more than a few words, but his presence was a quiet constant. He would stand on the path, watching her work, his hands clasped behind his back. Sometimes he would ask a practical question about a particular plant, his query always rooted in the science of horticulture, never its beauty. What is the proper pH for the soil to support rhododendrons? Or, that species requires more drainage. It was his way of engaging, of participating in her world on his own terms. Ilara found herself looking forward to these brief, strange encounters. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, the slight relaxation of his shoulders when a plant she had nurtured showed new growth, the faint frown of concentration as he examined the structure of a pruned branch. He was a man who understood systems, order, and the logic of the natural world. In her careful restoration of the garden, he saw a process he could comprehend and, perhaps, respect. One evening, A fierce autumn gale swept in from the sea, rattling the window panes and screaming around the turrets of the manor. The storm was a wild, violent thing, and it seemed to stir the restless spirits of the house. Unable to sleep, Elara wrapped herself in a shawl and made her way to the library, seeking the comfort of a book. She was surprised to find the Duke there, standing before the great stone hearth, a glass of brandy in his hand, staring into the roaring flames. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his face, accentuating its harsh angles and the deep-seated sorrow in his eyes. He looked more vulnerable than she had ever seen him, stripped of his usual iron control by the fury of the storm outside and the turmoil of the storm within. He did not seem surprised to see her. He simply nodded toward the chair opposite his. The storm will not abate until morning. It was an invitation. She sat, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and for a long time they simply watched the fire. The only sounds the howl of the wind and the crackle of burning logs. The charged silence was different tonight. It was not empty, but full of unspoken thoughts. Her gaze drifted to a small rosewood box on the mantelpiece. It was intricately carved with vines and flowers, its silver clasp tarnished with age. She had noticed it before, but had never paid it much mind. Tonight, however, it seemed to draw her eye. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the storm. He followed her gaze, and a shadow passed over his face. He said nothing. Elara, emboldened by the strange intimacy of the stormy night, rose and walked to the mantel. She reached out a hand, her fingers hovering just above the polished wood. "May I?" His voice, when he answered, was tight, strained. "It is locked." "Is there a key?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "There is no key," he replied, his tone sharp, final, a warning. She let her hand fall, turning back to face him. His composure was cracking. The muscle in his jaw was tight, his knuckles white around his glass. The storm outside was a physical manifestation of the tempest raging within him. "It was hers," he said, his voice low and guttural, as if the words were being torn from him. "Isabel's, a music box. She loved it." He downed the rest of his brandy in a single, harsh swallow. He stared into the fire, his eyes seeing not the flames, but a memory. "This storm," he began, his voice rough with an emotion so raw it made Elara's heart ache. "It was a night like this, the wind, the rain." He fell silent, and Elara held her breath, knowing she was on the precipice of the great dark secret that defined him. She did not prompt him, did not speak. She simply waited, offering him the silent gift of her patient presence. "She was in labor," he said, the words choked, fragmented. "The doctor was delayed by the storm. The roads were flooded. A bridge was washed out." He closed his eyes, his face a mask of agony. She was so small, so delicate. The labor was difficult, too difficult. He opened his eyes, but they were focused on a decade-old horror. "She was frightened of the storm. She asked me to play her music box. She said the tune calmed the baby." His breath hitched. "I was winding it when she cried out. The last time she cried out." The story spilled out of him then, a torrent of grief held back for 10 years. His wife, Isabel, had died giving birth to their son, who had survived her by only a few hours. It had all happened in their bedroom upstairs, while a storm just like this one had raged outside, the sound of the wind and rain mingling with the sounds of her agony and his own desperate, useless prayers. He had been holding the rosewood music box in his hands when the midwife had come out, her face ashen, and told him they were both gone. I blamed myself, he whispered, his voice cracking. I was the Duke. I was supposed to be able to command the world, but I couldn't even command the weather. I couldn't save her. My love. It wasn't a shield for her. It was a vulnerability. It brought her here, to this remote place. It led her to her death. He looked at Alara then, his eyes filled with a decade of unshed tears and self-loathing. After, I couldn't bear the sight of anything she had loved, anything that reminded me of the life we had, the life I had destroyed. He gestured vaguely around the room, at the house, at the world beyond the windows. I locked it all away, her rooms, the garden, the music box. I thought if I could seal away the memories, I could seal away the pain. I built a fortress of silence and solitude, and I sentenced myself to live in it. I swore I would never feel anything like that again, never risk loving anyone, because my love is a curse. It is death. The confession, raw and devastating, filled the space between them. The storm outside seemed to fade, its fury nothing compared to the desolation in his voice. He had not just lost a wife and child, he had lost himself. He had entombed his heart with them, believing it was a penance he was required to pay for the rest of his life. Alara's own sorrows, her own public humiliation and private loneliness seemed small and insignificant in the face of his profound, all-consuming grief. She saw him now, not as the cold, formidable Duke of Blackwood, but as Alistair, a man shattered by loss, a man who had punished himself with a cruelty far greater than any court could devise. Her heart did not feel pity. It felt a deep, resonant wave of compassion, an empathy that transcended words. She understood, in that moment, the root of all his coldness, all his distance. It was not hatred or indifference. It was fear, a terrifying, paralyzing fear of feeling, of loving, of losing again. She rose from her chair and crossed the space between them. She did not speak. She simply reached out and placed her hand gently on his arm. His muscles were rigid, coiled like a spring. Through the fine wool of his coat, she could feel him trembling. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. He seemed to be expecting revulsion, or perhaps pity. What he saw in her eyes, however, was something else entirely, a quiet, steadfast understanding. "You did not fail her," Alara said, her voice soft but firm, a beacon in his storm. "You loved her. A storm is not a curse, Alistair. It is just a storm. Sometimes things break, and it is no one's fault." She spoke from her own experience, from the wreckage of her own life. Sometimes hearts are broken by the careless whims of others. Sometimes they are broken by the cruel indifference of fate. But the breaking itself did not have to be the end of the story. He stared at her, the mask of the Duke finally, completely gone, leaving only the raw, wounded man beneath. The fortress had been breached, not by force, but by a quiet, compassionate hand that offered not a cure, but a shared solace in the darkness. The storm raged on outside, but within the firelit library, for the first time in 10 years, a profound and fragile calm began to descend upon the soul of Alistair Blackwood. The Duke, Alistair, did not pull away from her touch. He stood utterly still, as if her hand on his arm were the only thing anchoring him in the swirling vortex of his memories. The confession had hollowed him out, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in a way she never could have imagined. In his story, she finally understood the full scope of his pain, the architecture of the prison he had built for himself. Her compassion for him was a deep, quiet river, washing away the last vestiges of her fear and resentment. He finally lowered himself into his chair, his movements stiff and weary, like an old soldier after a long battle. Elara withdrew her hand and sat opposite him again, a silent guardian of his fragile truce with the past. The storm outside began to subside, its furious howl diminishing to a mournful sigh. The fire in the hearth burned low, the room filled with a warm, intimate glow. "After she was gone," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual authority. "The silence was absolute. I thought I wanted it. I thought it was a mercy. But it became its own kind of torture. The house was so full of her absence. Every room, every corridor echoed with it." He looked at her, his pale eyes luminous in the firelight. "When you came here, you brought a different kind of silence with you. A quietness, a stillness. It was peaceful. It did not echo. It was the most profound compliment he could have given her. She, who had felt like a ghost, an invisible presence in his home, had been a comfort to him in her very quietness. She had not intruded on his grief. She had simply coexisted with it, and in doing so, had lessened its power. "I was so angry," he continued, his gaze drifting back to the flames. "At the doctor, at the storm, at God. Most of all, at myself. The garden." She poured her soul into it. Every flower, every path, was a piece of her. When I looked at it, all I could see was her, laughing in the sun. All I could feel was the life I had failed to protect. So I locked the gate. I thought, if I could not see it, I would not have to remember. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "As if I could ever stop remembering." "But you let me bring it back," Elara said softly. "Why?" He was silent for a long time, considering her question. "I do not know," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "When you asked for the key, I should have refused. It was a violation of every rule I had set for myself. But there was something in your eyes, a resolve. You were not asking for a trifle to pass the time. You were asking for something to save. I think a part of me wanted to see if it was possible, if something so dead could be brought back to life." The unspoken meaning hung between them, as real and tangible as the rosewood box on the mantel. He was not just talking about the garden. They sat in companionable silence until the first grey light of dawn began to creep through the tall library windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and smelling of rain and damp earth. A profound exhaustion had settled over Alistair, but it was the weariness of a fever that has finally broken, not the soul-deep fatigue of unending grief. As Elara rose to leave, he stood as well. "Elara," he said, her name on his lips still a strange and wonderful novelty. She turned to him. He took a step closer, his height and presence no longer intimidating, but protective. He reached out, and with a hesitation that spoke volumes, his fingers gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was feather-light, yet it sent a jolt of warmth through her entire being. It was the first time he had touched her with anything approaching tenderness. It was not the touch of a husband to his contractual duchess. It was the touch of a man to a woman. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. Her heart, which she had thought so thoroughly broken and then so carefully guarded, began to beat with a new, tentative rhythm of hope. She simply nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and left him standing in the dawn light. The revelation of that night changed everything. The walls between them, both physical and emotional, crumbled into dust. He no longer confined himself to the West Wing. She no longer felt like a visitor in her own home. He began to join her for breakfast, and their meals were no longer silent ordeals. They talked. At first, their conversations were stilted, explorations of safe topics, estate matters, the tenants, the books they were reading. But gradually, they deepened. He asked her about her childhood, about her love of art and literature. He listened, truly listened, with an attentiveness that made her feel seen and valued in a way she had never been before. In turn, she learned more about him. She learned of his passion for astronomy, his brilliant mind for mathematics and engineering, the weight of the ducal responsibilities he had borne with such grim determination. She saw the man behind the title, the sharp intellect, the dry, surprising wit that would surface unexpectedly, the deep well of integrity that governed his every action. He walked with her in the garden every afternoon. It was their place. He would watch as she tended the flowers, and he would talk about Isabel, no longer with the raw agony of that stormy night, but with a gentle, wistful sadness. He spoke of her laughter, her fierce love for life, her unshakable belief in the goodness of people. In sharing his memories with Alara, he was not replacing Isabel, but honoring her. He was allowing her spirit to live on, not as a source of pain, but as a source of love. And Alara, free from jealousy or insecurity, listened with an open, compassionate heart. She came to love the woman she had never met, the woman whose garden she had brought back to life. One sunny afternoon, as they sat together on the stone bench, now free of its thorny prison, Alistair reached into his pocket and produced a small silver key. "I found it," he said simply, holding it out to her. She knew instantly what it was for. Together, they went back to the library, to the rosewood box on the mantel. Alara's hands trembled slightly as she fitted the key into the tarnished lock. It turned with a soft click. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on faded velvet lining, was a delicate silver ballerina. Alistair reached past her and carefully wound the mechanism. A tinkling, heartbreakingly beautiful melody filled the room. It was a tune full of sweetness and sorrow, of love and loss. He did not look at the box. He looked at Alara, his pale eyes full of a new, dawning light. "The music is not just sad anymore," he said, his voice thick. "With you, I am beginning to hear the beautiful notes again." It was in that moment, with the ghost of a lullaby playing between them, that Alara knew she was irrevocably in love with him. It was a love that had grown slowly, quietly, in the cleared soil of their shared solitude, nurtured by compassion and understanding. It was a love as resilient and as stubborn as the crimson rose in the garden. He seemed to read the truth in her eyes. He gently closed the lid of the music box, silencing the tune. He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers, a natural, easy gesture that felt more intimate than any kiss. He led her from the library, through the halls of the manor that were no longer cold and empty, but filled with the promise of a new life, and out into the afternoon sun. He led her to the garden, to their sanctuary. The garden was a riot of late-season colour. The constant heart rose bush was covered in a final, glorious flush of crimson blooms. The air was sweet with the scent of lavender and damp earth. The world seemed to hold its breath. Alistair turned to face her, still holding her hand. He looked down at their joined fingers, then up into her eyes. The last of the shadows had fled from his face. replaced by an emotion so powerful and clear it took her breath away. It was love. Awestruck, world-altering love. "When you came to Blackwood," he began, his voice low and steady, a resonant hum that vibrated through her, "I was a ruin, a man living in a tomb of his own making. I asked you for nothing but duty and an heir. I offered you nothing but a cold and empty life. It was a monstrously selfish bargain, and you, with your grace and your strength, accepted it." He lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You, Ilara, with your quiet compassion, you did not just restore this garden, you restored me. You walked into the ruins of my life, and you did not try to rebuild what was lost. You planted something new. You tended it with a patience I did not deserve. You have shown me that a heart can break and still learn to beat again, that it can love again." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, blurring the beautiful, earnest face of the man she loved. "My marriage to Isabel was one of youthful, sunlit love," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It will always be a part of me, a beautiful, cherished memory. But what I feel for you, it is different. It is a love forged in darkness and brought into the light. It is deeper, stronger, forged by the storms we have weathered, both apart and together. It is a love of the soul." He released her hand, only to gently cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheeks. "I love you, Ilara. I love your strength, your quietness, your fierce and gentle heart. I do not want to be your duke. I want to be your husband, in every sense of the word. I want to build a life with you, a real life, full of laughter and light and conversation. I want to honor the terms of our contract, not as a duty, but as a joy. I want to give you children, not just for an heir, but for us." He searched her eyes, his own full of a desperate, hopeful plea. "Is it possible? After everything, after the coldness I have shown you, could you love a man like me?" The tears spilled over, tracing paths down her cheeks. "A man like you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh, Alistair, I already do. I think I have. For a very long time." A slow, radiant smile spread across his face, a true, unguarded smile that transformed him completely, chasing away the last of the winter from his eyes and leaving only the brilliant light of spring. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion, but of profound, reverent love. It was a kiss of homecoming, a promise of 1,000 shared dawns, of a future cultivated from the ashes of the past. It was the sealing of a new contract, one written not in ink, but on the resilient, stubborn, and finally, joyfully beating hearts of two souls who had found each other in the ruins and built a love that was strong enough to bloom forever. A year later, the laughter of a child echoed in the halls of Blackwood Manor. It was a sound of pure, untroubled joy, a sound that chased the last of the ghosts from the shadowed corners and filled the old stone house with a light it had not known for a generation. Ilara, the Duchess of Blackwood, stood by the tall windows of the nursery, her infant son, Arthur, cradled in her arms. He had his father's dark hair, but her calm and observant eyes. Outside, the garden was in full, magnificent bloom. It was no longer her project, but theirs. Alistair had taken a keen interest, his analytical mind finding a new fascination in the complex ecosystems of the plants. They spent hours there together, planning, planting, and simply being. The constant heart rosebush had spread, its crimson blossoms a vibrant testament to their enduring love. The manor itself was transformed. Fresh flowers, cut daily by Alara, graced every room. The heavy drapes were drawn back, letting the sunlight stream in. The west wing was no longer forbidden territory. His study was now a shared space, a sketching easel set up near his desk. The silence that had once defined their home was now a comfortable, companionable peace, punctuated by conversation, laughter, and the beautiful, tinkling melody of a rosewood music box, which they often played for their son. Seraphina and Valerius never visited again. Ilara heard rumors, whispers on the wind of society, that their passionate match had cooled into a brittle, resentful union. Valerius's fortune dwindling under the strain of their extravagant lifestyle. Ilara felt no triumph, only a quiet, distant pity for the life she had escaped. Her father's debts had been settled as promised, and her family was secure, though her relationship with her mother and sister remained one of polite, formal distance. Her true family was here, within these warm stone walls. Alistair entered the nursery, his footsteps silent on the rug. He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around both her and their son. He pressed a kiss to her temple, his touch now as familiar and as necessary as breathing. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice a low, warm rumble against her ear. She leaned back against his solid strength, her heart full to bursting. "I was thinking about how a place that once felt like a tomb now feels like the most alive place in the world." He tightened his embrace, his gaze following hers out to the flourishing garden. "That is because you are its heart, Ilara. You always have been." He turned her in his arms, and the love that shone in his eyes was a constant, brilliant sun, a love that had not only healed him, but had completed her. She had come to Blackwood seeking survival and had found salvation. She had agreed to a loveless contract and had discovered the love of a lifetime. The smile she gave her husband was no longer the quiet, reserved expression of her youth, but one of radiant, boundless joy, a smile that could coax the sun from behind any cloud. In the quiet peace of their home, surrounded by the life they had nurtured together, the resilient noblewoman and the redeemed duke had found there forever. Theirs was not a story of a perfect beginning, but of a beautiful, hard-won, and everlasting peace. Dear listener, have you ever felt like you were living in the ruins of someone else's past, or perhaps the ruins of your own? We often find ourselves in situations not of our making, a broken promise, a sudden loss, a future that crumbles before it can even begin. Like Ilara, we can be handed a life that feels cold, empty, and devoid of hope, a contract for survival rather than a blueprint for joy. Ilara's story reminds us of the profound power of quiet, patient cultivation. She didn't arrive at Blackwood Manor and demand that the Duke heal himself. She didn't try to force the doors of his heart open. Instead, she found a small, neglected corner of his world, a forgotten garden, and she began, with her own 2 hands, to bring it back to life. She weeded, she nurtured, she tended to the small, resilient sparks of beauty that had survived the neglect. And in doing so, she created a space where healing became possible. Her compassion was her trowel, her patience was the sunlight. She showed the broken man beside her that what is ruined can be remade, not by erasing the past, but by gently integrating it into a new, more hopeful present. She didn't replace the memory of his first love. She made space for it, honored it, and allowed a new love to grow alongside it. stronger, and more deeply rooted for having been nourished in difficult soil. How many of us have a locked garden in our own lives or in the lives of those we love? A place of past pain that has been sealed off, left to decay. We may not be able to demand the key, but we can, like Ilara, choose to cultivate the ground we stand on. We can bring a flower into a silent room. We can offer a moment of quiet companionship instead of demanding conversation. We can perform small, consistent acts of care and compassion, not with the goal of fixing someone, but with the simple, selfless intention of bringing a tovetoi, little more life into a lonely space. Ilara's journey from a discarded fiancé to a cherished duchess wasn't about finding a prince to rescue her. It was about her discovering her own power to restore, to heal, and to love. She rescued him, not with a grand gesture, but with the steady, quiet strength of her own resilient heart. So, if you find yourself in a season of winter, look for the forgotten garden. Start small. Pull one weed. Nurture one surviving bloom. You may find that in bringing life back to the world around you, you are in fact saving yourself. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even after the longest winter, spring is always possible.